Hello and welcome to Between the Lines. I'm Shannon Bessie and I'm here with Esther Hatch and Tracy Hunter Abramson and Sarah M. Eden. And today we are going to discuss the value of some usually unsung heroes, secondary characters. So secondary characters, they rarely have their own point of view, and they're usually interacting with characters in such a way that we really wouldn't have the same love for the books and movies that we love without them. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask you each, who are some of the secondary characters that you love the most in movies and books that most of our listeners would be familiar with?
Okay, this one, you could ask my kids and they'd be able to answer this very quickly. I love Pascal and Maximus from Tangled. That's the chameleon and the horse. And Sven from Frozen. That's the reindeer. I apparently like animals. But I also love Batman from the Lego movie, to the point that on my birthday, my children are charged with singing Batman's song, Darkness, No Parents, to me on my birthday. Like, I have a deep, abiding love. And so I thought, what it is about these characters that I love so much? And I think it's that they're all quirky. They all offer an interesting perspective and commentary, very much the comic relief. I feel like they add that extra element of unusual humor. And I've always been a fan of unusual humor. So that's what I look for.
I love that. I love that. And we are going to talk a little bit about what these characters add. Obviously, quirky humor is right up at the top for Sarah. And you know, I'm right there with you, Sarah. I think when I think of secondary characters that have taken on they've just taken over people's thoughts and people just love them. So many of them come from the Disney movies. For me in Frozen, it's Olaf. And I know that Sarah and Tracy and I don't know, Esther, have you ever seen the theater production of Frozen?
I haven't, no.
We were able to see it when we visited London recently, and Olaf is done as it's a puppetry type thing. But even then, he is such a huge character. He's such a big part of this, that you're just watching this puppet instead of all the live actors that are on stage. Other Disney movies, Chip in Beauty and the Beast, the mice in Cinderella, and then some of the other movies, 3CPO and R2-D2 in Star Wars, Hagrid in Harry Potter. There are just so many.
Yeah, I think for me, I kind of go back in time a little bit. Like, I watch a lot of classics, and I don't know how many of you guys have watched the old Murder, She Wrote shows, sure. But the ones I love are like Dr. Seth Hazlitt and what is it, Sheriff Amos Tupper. It's like they're just goofy, or they're predictable enough. Like, you feel like they're real people. And I think that's probably one of the most important things for secondary characters is they not only, I don't know, they just kind of come to life on the screen.
Yeah. And it's funny, as you guys are talking about some of your favorites, I can remember like lines from the, like, I remember, spouting off lines from the mice in Cinderella as a kid. Like, they just were memorable characters that you fell in love with. And the first one I thought of is Inigo Montoya, and like, what other character has another line that people repeat more than anything? Like, hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. So
you killed my father.
Yes,
prepare to die.
Everyone knows him, and the movie and the book would just not be the same without Inigo Montoya. Like, he's such a vibrant, fun, and intense character. Another one that I thought of was Samwise Gamgee from The Lord of the Rings. And like, I am like maybe weird in that I actually like the movies better than the books of those. But in the movie, I just remember like crying about how good of a friend he was. And like, I think they can bring out these like amazing emotions, these side characters. Mm-hmm. One of my most favorite and intriguing side characters was written by Elizabeth Gaskell in Wives and Daughters. She's probably not quite as well known, but Cynthia in that book, she's I just remember reading her, and I don't often think like, wow, how did the author do that? But I did with her because her character cannot love people. She doesn't really understand it, but everyone loves her. And I loved her. And I'm like, how do you make a character that complex? I don't know. It's fantastic.
Oh, I love those. I love, Esther, the fact that you, in this whole group, you are the deep thinker. We're just talking
was
about
like, I enjoy
and
Lego
mice.
and it's just like, I like digging deep into the psychology of secondary
Yeah.
characters.
We're just singing the mice song.
I'm doing that too.
Oh,
She's
So-
the brains of this operation.
This is not
obviously.
true.
Obviously. So, okay, so let's the rest of us try and get on board with Esther here. How do these secondary characters, how do they move the plot along, even though they may not have a principal role or even a part in the story? They may not even have much of a voice.
So since I primarily write suspense, the secondary characters often provide like that source of information that you wouldn't see otherwise. It's like you're creating pieces of the puzzle, and without them, you just can't create the whole, the entire story. It just wouldn't be seen without them present.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think each extra character in a book, to an extent, obviously, if you do too many, it doesn't quite work, but they just add another dimension to the book. A lot of times they've shaped the main character. Like if you look at like parents are often like an oft-used side character, and so often that dynamic of how they were raised and what problems they had in their childhood shape who the characters are now. But a lot of times, like I look at Inigo Montoya, he just added more flavor. I mean, like it wasn't necessarily like he's building up or taking down the main characters, but like just an intense person that is one more person to love as you read the book or watch the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think one really great thing that secondary characters can do is they provide opportunities for, I know anyone who writes has heard this phrase, but show, don't tell, because they reveal things that readers need to know or need to see without the writer just saying, psst. I think of Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen could have just somehow come forward and said, hey, you guys are misjudging Mr. Darcy because the only perspective you're getting is Elizabeth's and she's misjudging him. She could have kind of done that and just told us, but instead she brings in Mr. Bingley, secondary character who we all love because he falls in love with Jane. We know he has good taste in people. It was a good person, and he is best friends with this man that we're all convinced is a horrible person. So we know in the back of our minds, there has to be something we're missing. It keeps that door open. It allows the writer to show us there's something we're missing without telling us what it is. And that helps further the plot because we keep wanting to know what we're missing.
Oh, that's perfect. I love that. And I totally agree. I think that these secondary characters, they add depth to the main characters as we see how they interact with the secondary characters. Are they kind to children? Are they kind to the servants? Are they able to laugh at themselves if someone makes fun of them? All of those kinds of things develop our main characters in that show, not tell kind of way.
Right.
Okay, so I think I'm right in saying that all of us have written books with secondary characters who then went on to be main characters in later books. So tell me how that happened. Had you always planned on moving the secondary character over and giving them their own story, their own book? Or did the character say, excuse me, it's my turn when you were writing it?
Yeah, I have a pretty distinct one. My first book came out, The Roses of Feldstone. It's standalone. I started writing my second book, which is now a proper scandal. It was originally called The Reluctant Seductress, but we won't talk about that. But
That's a podcast for another time.
So I was writing my second book, had no intentions of writing a series. I hadn't done it yet. I didn't know how to do it. And suddenly there was this character who named Lord Bryant, who had so much of a story to tell that because of that one character, it's not just that I wrote his book, I also wrote a second book because I was like, well, I can't just write 2 books in a series. So he kind of determined like, oh, this one standalone book has now become a series, and it's been awesome. So yeah.
I love
That's
that.
great.
My very, very first one that I wrote had a secondary character who I knew. It was The Kiss of a Stranger. We have Philip, who's Lord Lambton. He shows up on the page, and I knew the minute he arrived that he was the main character in his own story, and he knew it. Like, he showed up and looked at me like, I will be a secondary character for now, but just know I'm the main character. And so I knew he had to have a story because it was so obvious that he did. And from then on, because again, that was my first, as I developed secondary characters, I would put enough time into them to recognize that they were the main character in their own life and in their own story. Whether or not I wrote it, I knew that had to be true, or else they came out, for me in my process, they came out too flat. So that's where it started with me, a secondary character who showed up and looked me in the eye and said, you realize I'm a main character, right? And I had to run with it.
Oh, that's so great. And that's why I asked the question the way I did, because I know that most of us have experienced that, where the characters are basically dictating what's happening, not the author. And I think that mine is a little different than that. When I wrote The Noble Smuggler, like Esther, I assumed it was going to be a standalone book. And it was actually some of my readers, Merrily Merrill in particular, I think was the first one to write to me and say, you have to write Alexander's story. And Alexander was the best friend of the main character in Noble Smuggler, Jonas's best friend. And as I went back and looked at that book, I thought, you know, she's right. This Alexander needs his own story. And so it became Uncommon Earl, and the Georgian Gentleman series began because of that. And like Sarah, I looked at some of the secondary characters differently after that as to which one of these needs their story next.
Right.
So, and for me, mine was kind of different because my first books were a trilogy, and Amy Whitmore was the younger sister of one of the main characters in that trilogy. And I sat down to write a new book, and I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? And all of a sudden she pops up as an adult. She was like, I think she may have still been a teenager at the time during the trilogy. And that became, she was basically a love interest for the first character I did a Saint Squad book on. So that I'm now working on the 14th book in that series. So it was just like, but as I was writing Freefall, which was her book, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, these characters all have a story. Like the minute I started writing that book, I'm like, I know how this whole series is going to work. They're all going to have their own story. So, but like I said, when I first started, I had no idea when I was writing the books that she was gonna do this to me, or that her father would be demanding to be in almost all my books.
He's like, hi, I'd like to introduce myself. We're gonna hang out a lot.
He's so humble too. It's really quite comical.
Oh, so funny. Okay, so I know we get this question a lot, and I know it's an awful question. Which is your favorite book? And so I'm not going to ask you that, but the next question is close. So of all of the secondary characters you've written, which one is your favorite? And this can be someone who later received their own story, or who still hasn't, where it's pending.
So I have to say probably Jim Whitmore is one of my favorites, but more than anything, and I've had readers tell me the same thing, I just wish he was real so he could run for president.
Oh, yeah.
It would be so cool. But I'm working on, one of the things I'm working on is his story going back in time. So I'm excited for that one.
I know about this, and I'm excited too. I think if I had to pick from my books, for a person who has received his story, it would be Alexander, the first one that I just mentioned from Noble Smuggler. It was really, I loved exploring his story. For someone who hasn't yet received a story, probably Aunt Millward, who has featured in a couple of the Georgian Gentleman books, and actually features fairly strongly in the one that comes out in April. So.
Yeah, it's so fun to hear all these side characters. I probably still have to go with Lord Bryant just because of what he did for that whole the whole series, and how excited everyone was for him and I was to tell his story. So I have to say Lord Bryant. If someone's who I haven't written, I was thinking about this a little bit more today, and in The Roses of Felstone, there's a chimney sweep boy that I've always wanted to tell his story. I actually have his story in my head, but it's sadly, I made a mistake in my book because I knew whose daughter I wanted him to marry, but they only had sons. So I'm like, I guess this story cannot be told
okay.
now. Because like I had the
have
whole
to
story,
ponder.
and then I'm like, oh, why did I put a epilogue that far in the future? We're gonna have to figure that out. So anyway,
Matchmake for Oliver somewhere
I
else.
know. Yeah.
This is a hard question, Sean.
I
don't know if
know.
I can choose
It is almost
a
as bad as
favorite.
which is your favorite book. I know. I
Right.
know.
Or favorite child.
Yes.
I could
know.
answer that. No. If amongst my favorite secondary
Yes,
characters,
that's
I would
totally
say
allowed.
is probably Lucas and Mater, or Julia, as she's known in her own story, Jonquil from the Jonquil Brothers series. It's the parents of this family of boys. And I love them in there because they offer so much like insight and advice, but they aren't intrusive. Well, Lucas isn't because he's dead, but they're there to offer direction without being overpowering. So they don't take over the stories, but they're such a crucial part to how these boys navigate. I say boys, they're men, how they navigate their lives, and getting to know their parents helps you get to know them better because it's, you know, how they were raised in the environment they're raised in. So I think those two. I have since gone back and written the story of how, you know, their marriage began and their group of friends and stuff, but they were great secondary characters throughout that whole series.
And I have to say, Sarah, that all the people who read your Jonquil series love Mater. You created a perfect secondary character in her. Everybody wants Mater to be their mother. Let's face it. And if she's not their mother, then at least they want to go to tea with her.
Exactly. Could she be an honorary mom? Because I could use that too.
Yes. So is there a type of secondary character that you haven't written yet that you'd really like to try? Either a role you'd like one to fill, or maybe a new demographic group, or just something completely different? I'll say that I don't think I have ever written a teenage secondary character. I'm not sure if I'm brave enough to do a teenage secondary character, but I do think that soon I will do another child secondary character because I had so much fun with Asher in Uncommon Earl that I think I'd like to try another child of a different age.
Probably the problem with teenagers is we want people to like our secondary characters. So no, I have teenagers and they're wonderful. I like mine. But
You got to go for the punchline. I get it.
yeah, just try to be funny, guys. Just try to be funny.
That's right. Quirky secondary characters.
That's me. That's who I am. So I'm thinking something that I've really never done, and because it's kind of out of my genre almost, is like a true villain, take over the world, destroy the world type character. And maybe, I do have a fantasy novel that I've written a long time ago, and I know it needs a better version of that. And so maybe that's why that first came to my head. But it's not necessarily something I would write in the types of books I'm writing now, but I would like to figure that out. I'd like to figure out how to write like a world dominating villain. Yeah.
That would be perfect.
I'd say I was trying to think of what I haven't written, and readers should tell me if there's something I haven't done yet. I don't think I've ever done a cat. So
There you go. I don't think you've done a
dogs, so I'm
gerbil
thinking
either.
maybe A cat should be in the future. I haven't
That's
done
when
what?
you do whatever they want. So. Speaking of a secondary character who knows they're the main character, that's
The
it.
cat.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Love it. I have no idea what kind of story this would fit in or how I would pull it off, but I would love to write a secondary character who is legitimately the main character's imaginary friend. Like not even a real person. but is a
Oh.
legit secondary character. I think that would be so fun.
Yeah.
That was
Oh.
So
awesome.
there you go. That's something I would love to
If
pull
anyone
off.
can pull it off, it's you, Sarah.
Yep.
Okay, how about you, listeners? Do you have a favorite secondary character from a movie or a book? We'd love to hear who they are and why you love them. Drop us a line on our Facebook or Instagram pages and join us again for our next episode of Between the Lines.